And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Self-Healing Journey. And today on our episode, we're going to talk about astrology. I'm starting this new series called Know Thyself, where I kind of break down some of the self-healing modalities that I use to help myself through kind of my own issues. And so today I'm very excited to share with you my own journey and why astrology is such an amazing modality to help you with whatever you're going through. And this is not going to be a breakdown of astrology. I'm actually going to share some of the more psychological and physical traits and spiritual traits of astrology. Okay. So I love this quote here just because it kind of explains this whole idea of belief, right? If you don't believe in something, you'll fall for anything. I believe everything happens for a reason. If you are strong from within, you can will anything. I'm a firm believer that where there's a will, there's a way, by Eric Davis. What's beautiful about this concept is just this idea that you don't necessarily need to believe in astrology, right? However, the whole concept of believing in astrology is actually believing in yourself. Once you really believe in yourself and who you are, everything shifts around that, right? Versus so many people are left looking for finding out who they are, and they're so easily persuaded or influenced to believe something that really isn't them, right? And I think a lot of us grow up and we become adults and we have these either careers or jobs that really don't make us happy, right? So this whole concept is really believing in yourself first, and from within who you are, you will actually create the life that you want to create, and you're not influenced by outside perspectives. So the content of this episode today, we'll talk about some misconceptions. I'll talk about my journey, break down the elements in astrology, and then just talk about who we are in astrology, right? And what astrology brings is multi-dimensional concept of who we are. And then we'll learn about the cycles and retrogrades that happen in astrology, which eventually leads us to understanding transits and how transits affects us all the time. And then a bigger conversation has always been free will versus destiny in astrology, right? If your story is written in the stars, then do you have free will, or are you just living through destiny? And then I think a lot of people have talked a lot about this recently now on social media. A lot of people share this, but the whole idea of shadow play, shadow work, being able to work with your shadows. Astrology really is good at bringing this to light so you can actually understand and deal with it. And then we'll talk about why astrology is hidden from mainstream concept. Why is it not taught in school? Why is it not really brought up anywhere else? And so it's a very interesting concept that I love to share. And then finally the conclusion of why astrology is a really important modality in your self-healing journey. Okay, so let's talk about some old misconceptions. I think people will often confuse horoscopes with astrology. And what's really important to understand is they're very different. Horoscope is, and you could look even at just the word horoscope, right? Horo means the hour. So it's actually breaking down who you are and then giving you a breakdown of who you are based on an hourly transit. And so the problem with these is they're very, very vague, and they're very generalized. And so a lot of times the people who will resonate with this are kind of looking for these concepts in their charts, right? And what you'll learn is like your sun sign is but a fraction of who you are. It's just the conscious part of who you are, but there's so many parts of who we are. And so that's very important to understand that I'm not talking about horoscopes. I'm talking about astrology. And astrology uses your full natal chart and birth chart to understand who you are and when you were born, who you're meant to be. And then we also talk about predictions. Predictions are actually based on transits, but the problem is when people are creating predictions, they are incepting your future, right? If you go to an astrologer or, as Asian Americans, as Asians, I know a lot of Vietnamese psychics who would predict what would happen to you. And sometimes they may be on point, but sometimes their own ego and their own perception filters the way they're speaking to you, and that could actually cause you to go against their prediction because you may not like the way they talk, and that suddenly creates a different time loop in whether or not you would have gone if you didn't hear a prediction, or whether or not you would have done it because you heard a prediction, right? So that's very important to distinguish. I don't do predictions. I believe that the more I tell you who you are, then you'll be able to actually predict what's going to happen to you, and you get to choose that path. And that we'll get into a little further into this whole idea of free will and a destiny. And then the other piece of the idea of astrology, let's say sun sign astrology, which is a very common thing that we see even in this little, old newspaper clipping. It takes the sun sign, like let's say a Leo, July 23rd, August 22nd. That's a stereotype, y'all. It's a very bad stereotype where you say like every Leo who's ever been born or those 30 days are going to experience this. It's like saying all Asian men are going to be this, right? All black people, all white people, all red people. Every concept of stereotypes fit in this idea that your astrology tells you who you are based on just 30 days that everybody experiences, right? So we got to be very careful about looking at horoscopes or even looking at sun sign astrology, because we might be prejudiced towards someone. It's really funny. There's been some articles today talking about how certain clubs are now using astrology to keep people who are Aries, who are born during the Aries time, from entering clubs. Now, there's definitely, we can all talk about how Aries might have a short temper and might get into fights a lot, but are you telling me that every person born in the sun sign Aries of the last 50 years are going to be naturally want to fight? And I think that's a pretty strong stereotype, and again, prejudice towards a sign, right? I actually know a lot of Aries, and most of them don't get into fights. They like to disagree, but they don't necessarily get into fights. And I think that's because they have different planets that gives them different colors to their Aryan perspective. So, actually today, as we're kind of having this gender conversation, maybe a funny joke would be like if someone say, hey, you're a Virgo, you must be this. I'm like, did you assume my rising sign is a Virgo or my moon is a Virgo? And so these are just very funny concept that, like, why would we stereotype astrology? And that's why this is really important, why I think a lot of people have left astrology or horoscopes, the whole concept of reading the stars. I totally did. I have 3 cousins who are all born around Virgo, and so we're all 4 of us are Virgos, yet none of us are the same. They might have that need to be analytical and very sharp and very perfectionist, but one cousin wants to fight all the time, the other cousin wants to keep the peace, and then the cousin who's like barely noticed, right? And so these are very strong description that a lot of their other signs and planets actually makes them a different type of Virgo. And so I just wanted to share a little bit of my journey as an astrologer, but also why I chose to go into astrology and actually read people's charts to help them. So if you look at my chart over here, you'll see that this whole section here are all Virgo energy. And so because I have a lot of planets in my Virgo sign, a lot of the Virgo stereotypes I would relate to because I have so many aspects of my chart that is Virgoan. However, if you notice here, I have actually a rising sign, a moon in Leo, a north node in Leo. So I actually have very strong tendencies to have these Leo aspects of myself. And so growing up during the high school, college days, this is the whole idea of where introverts and extrovert was a very common label for people, of people who like to stay at home and not go out and really just read a book or really self-analyze. While the Leo in me, every time I was out and about having fun, hanging out with friends, I was very loud, I was very entertaining, I love hanging out with people, making jokes, and that is very Leo, extroverted. And so because of that, I was stuck one point thinking, oh, I'm a Virgo, I must be introverted, so I don't want to go talk to people. Yet all my friends who saw me, they're like, Charlie, you're not an introvert. Actually, you're a pretty outspoken person when we hang out with you. And so uh, at that moment, this is where it becomes very difficult. Where am I a Virgo, right? And so in about 2012, when and usually that transit is a very powerful transit around in my chart as well, but I was going through kind of this spiritual awakening where a lot of people have been talking about this, but really it's kind of like this aspect of the spirit within you is starting to recognize itself beyond the physical or the mental aspect. And so during 2012, 2013, I started to look more into astrology, but I started to learn that there was all these other planets. I started to have someone who was all in astrology. They read a little bit of my chart, and it blew my mind. It blew my heart open that I actually was both an introvert and an extrovert, right? And I think too often in our Western culture of growing up, people like to say you are this or that. You cannot be this and that. And so what's beautiful about astrology is that it actually does create this idea that you can be this and that, right? And so how those work together is really what makes you this multifaceted person. And so around 2015, 2016, my journey went further into going from someone who loved looking at astrology. And I was actually at that point, I broke down my chart. I broke down which house were having which planets. I was trying to figure out these 12 zodiac signs. And so I went deep down into it, trying to understand myself. However, later on, when I got into virtual reality, what was really exciting for me is that I started to realize that my gifts allowed me to be better with the jobs that I was picking or the hobbies that I was doing. They matched it better in a way because I knew who I was. I didn't have to go explore as much. I didn't have to go try out, 10 different sports or watch 10 different movies to realize that actually I really like these types of movies and I'm going to keep doing it. Right now, I definitely learned to actually go outside of my comfort zone. However, it's very important that if you are aware of who you are already, you don't need to go and explore so much so that you're kind of still trying to look for yourself, right? And so that was a very important journey. And so around 2016, when we got into virtual reality, I decided to make a virtual reality game that actually teaches people how to read their natal chart or how to actually embody their chart, because I felt like so many people who didn't know who they were struggling with just finding fulfillment in life. And so that was kind of the beginning of my own journey. Is as I was kind of leaving corporate world, I was starting to look at my own chart to see who am I and how do I work in a place that is fulfilling to my soul. And so I like to kind of break down the whole concept of astrology in kind of modern day terms. I think a lot of people don't have been talking about this, but a lot of this is not really brought out as much. But the whole idea of psychology, right? We talk about these concepts of psychology, breaking down the categories and personality types. One of the most common one that was raised in the West is called and Winnie the Pooh is a great example of it. It creates these melancholic, phlegmatic, choleric, sanguine personality. You have this extrovert, introvert, and then the peaceful and perfect or playful and powerful categories, where it shows the different way personalities interact with each other, but were also how each personalities were very important in coming together to work with each other. And so we also see this in actually Brickman-Myers codes, where we have, again, this idea of extroverts and introverts. But then here they try to bring in 4 concepts. And so we have the thinkers and the feelers. And then we have the sensors, the intuitives. And then we have the judgers and perceivers, right? And so taking the personality, the categories further, they were able now to describe the actual traits of these, and they were able to now create multiple types. You probably heard this, right? You're an ETNJ or you're an IFNP, right? It just takes one of each of these categories and creates kind of this code of these 4 elements that describes who you are, right? And so what's really interesting is actually it matches closer to astrology. I'll show you also in modern literature, we have Harry Potter. We have the four houses. We have the Gryffindor that represents this heroic chivalry and pride and very powerful beings. We have the Ravenclaws are really all about reading and sharp. They're very quick with their mind, very thoughtful, but just very quick individuals, right? And then we have the Hufflepuff. They're really caring and patient people. They like take their time to do things. They're very warm, but they might be a little stubborn and lazy because they take their time, right? So they're not as fast as maybe the Gryffindor or Ravenclaw, but you can count on them because they'll still probably be there for you, in months or years. And then we have the Slytherins. They really represent this whole talent and ambition, and they have charisma. And so these four elements actually represents the fire, air, water, and earth elements in psychology. And you can kind of see with also the Brigham Myers or even the Winnie the Pooh phlegmatics and all that, it really does resonate to these four. However, now we can kind of like go to the next level of that integration, which now we see in Avatar, where you have also the air element and how they have a whole culture around the air concept, earth, fire, and water. But what's more brilliant in Avatar that I really, really love is the fact that the Avatar is a being that can actually control all four elements. And that is really the crux of astrology. You actually have the four elements, but you are finding the right balance of those elements within you that actually colors your life, colors a different way that you are in person, in public, or where you are in private with other people. Those actually would change your element depending on what's happening in your life. So it actually shows that we're much more of a blend of energies or personalities rather than we're strictly one or the other, right? So it goes back to this concept that in the East, we like to include everything rather than exclude things because we want to focus on one element. And so in astrology, this actually then goes back to where I was saying the elements, right? In the fire elements, we have the character traits that are all about expressive, passionate, being honest, and inspirational. And we see those in the fire element signs like here, Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. And so if you notice, there are four elements, but there are also three types of that element, right? So Aries is a different kind of fire compared to Leo, compared to Sagittarius. And so if you take these four elements with the three variants of that element, you actually get 12 archetypes. And that's how we get the astrology archetypes, right? I'm not going to break these down. I actually did a whole video on breaking down and understanding astrology and its foundations. What I want this episode to be is actually to give people an opportunity to go and explore it themselves, right? But to understand how astrology can really help us understand who we are so we can start a self-healing journey. And so who are we, right? Who is every individual? And so as a programmer, as a coder, I used to make games. And so creating NPCs, and some of you guys know these people as the non-playable characters. These were people that were in the world that you cannot play as, right? And so each of these characters had to have a personality, right? If you create any world, if you are making movies, if you're making books, if you're making franchises, it's very important to make very believable characters because these believable characters is what makes your stories more relevant, right? And so it's really important to understand that because now if you look at us today, understanding what makes up who we are, then to a programmer like me, it's basically understanding the language of creating characters. And so in astrology, you'll kind of see often is this chart. You might see it in the Vedic chart is a square with triangles. However, in the West, we use kind of this circular chart, and you'll see here 1 through 12. This 1 through 12 never changes. However, if you see here, Aries being in the first house, this wheel outside here actually moves and changes depending on what time you were born. And so it's very important that when you check your astrology, you actually have the exact time that you were born, that you came onto the planet, because at that moment, your soul, your spirit imprinted based on the first breath you took. And that's why we tend to look at your birth time, because that gives you the imprint of your soul. And then once you kind of have this wheel moved around depending on your birth time, you then will start throwing all of these planets into this chart. And if you can see here, these are kind of the planets that have influence in your life, right? So we all know the sun sign tends to be more of this, the self awareness, right? The conscious being that's asking the questions, that's really talking to themselves, trying to understand things, right? That's our conscious thoughts. However, the moon shows up as our subconscious thoughts, our emotions, our instincts. A lot of these happen and we don't process it, right? When we feel something, we didn't go, hey, I feel like I want to be happy right now. It just happens, right? And so it's this subconscious emotion that happens, and we kind of naturally ride that wave. And I don't want to break down all these. I've done other episodes, but if you can see, all of these actually represent different aspects of who you are. Everybody in their chart has all of these planets, right? However, these planets are different depending on who you are and depending on when you were born. And what's really beautiful is once you start looking at these planets down here, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, they are considered generational planets. And so actually Pluto tends to represent a generation. So when we say millennials, when we say Gen Z, Gen X, they actually represent the Pluto's transits. Where Pluto was in Scorpio, it was the millennials. When Pluto was in Libra, the generation before that, they were called Gen X. I'm part of the Gen X. And so that's kind of where, but I'm at the cusp. And so you kind of start to understand, looking at people's charts, which generation they come from because of their Pluto. And so this is really important to understand, is everybody has this, but where it shows up is different. It's kind of like saying everybody's got a unique fingerprint, but all the fingerprints are made of the same matter, right? The skin and the oils, but how they create their geometry is different for every person. So how these planets show up on your chart is different for every person. And that's why it's so brilliant to be able to look at it and be able to understand someone. And so this is kind of what the chart will look like. This is my chart, obviously. And so for me, I chose to put a whole bunch of planets in Virgo, Scorpio, and Virgo, Leo, and then a few trickled down into the Cancer, Scorpio element here. And even this idea that I didn't put anything in these houses over here and they look empty doesn't mean I don't have abilities in those space, but it will actually show how I'm open to receive things in the world, versus here in my first house, I tend to have a very particular way to see the world. Okay.